Hello, everybody. It's 11 a.m. where I am in Washington, D.C., with great appreciation to those of you who are up earlier on the West Coast, and greater appreciation, if I may, to those of you in Asia who are up very late. We are recording this, which we might have told you earlier to enable you to see the recording is supposed to stay alive, but we're glad you're here, and we're glad that you'll have a chance to participate in this conversation live. Let me say at the outset, really look forward as much as possible in this kind of now familiar Zoom webinar format, but one that is also still awkward enough that we can have as much of a conversation as possible. So as we go, to the extent that questions come to your mind, throw them in the Q&A down below. If you mistakenly put them in the chat, we'll probably find them as well. Probably I'll be reading them out towards the end as we get through the conversation with the panelists, but it's also possible I'll call on you. So stay alert and stay on your toes. I'm Dan Viederman. I know many of you from my time at Verite and now with the Working Capital Fund. Thrilled to have you all here and thrilled to see old friends again. And thank you to those who saw this listed on social media or on our newsletter. That you're willing to join and join us. Let me give you a word or two of introduction. It'll be a little more than a word or two. And then we'll jump into the work with this great collection of panelists. The word or two describes, I guess, a couple of focuses, one of which is the Working Capital Fund itself has invested in each of the companies that you see represented up here on the table. The Working Capital Fund is an effort to use venture capital techniques to build solutions to the problems of labor exploitation in supply chains. We are doing this, we adopted this approach to solving these problems because the problems themselves have been so persistent over such a long period of time. I mean, I myself have been working in the field for probably almost 20 years or so, evidence of the inadequacy of the solutions I've come up with so far, the need for innovation, that we're still, in many cases, working on the same stuff that we worked on a long time ago. That has its origins in the complexity of supply chains and in the inadequacy of regulation and the inability of workers to speak for themselves and organize for themselves, multifaceted set of origins. But we also recognize that there is a lot of innovation and, of course, a lot of increased regulation and increased pressure on multinationals in particular and their suppliers to do better, to understand, and to resolve labor rights problems in their global supply chains. So this innovation and this sort of increased pressure or regulation or requirement hasn't yet matched, right? Particularly it hasn't matched its scale. We're still seeing a lot of reasonably kind of one-off, smaller scale interventions. And our Working Capital Fund is intended to provide the kind of growth capital to innovations like those you see represented here that will enable them to achieve the scale that's needed to make meaningful progress against these persistent labor rights problems in supply chains. There is a market into which they are selling. There's at least hundreds of millions of dollars being spent each year on social compliance and supply chain social responsibility, mostly in the form of expenditure against social audits, which are not as effective, certainly not as effective as they need to be, and frankly are not generally implemented in a way that will lead to effectiveness. And so there's a market they can sell into, and there's not enough philanthropy anyway to enable innovations like these to come to the scale that they need. So we're taking equity investment, providing growth capital, and then helping these companies along in partnership with other funders and in partnership with others. Our investors are around our table at Working Capital Fund include human rights funders like the Loudest Foundation, formerly CNA Foundation, like Humanity United itself, impact investors like the Soros Economic Development Fund, and multinationals represented by the Walmart Foundation, Apple, the Walt Disney Company, Zalando, and a couple of others, and DFID is around the table as well. So we've cobbled together, we built this collection of people with different institutions with different perspectives on the problem, a different orientation to trying to solve it, all in the interest of enabling kind of innovation that you see represented here to scale and find impact. So that's the background to us and our relationship, Working Capital's relationship to the institutions represented. Now the question of technology, another really important piece of backdrop. Why is tech especially important at the table here? Well, it offers the promise of scaled implementation, cost-effective implementation, real-time information and large-scale data gathering that we believe can come together and create meaningful interventions that would be enabled by multinationals, by suppliers, by regulators, and of course by workers organizations themselves. So tech in general offers those characteristics that can be beneficial. Tech for workers offer characteristics as well. We can find distributed and often quote unquote hidden populations of workers, of course not hidden to them, but hidden to those in global supply chains who might want to provide some support or some intervention that can benefit those workers. So tech has its role, and we at Working Capital invested in tools like these that are directly used by workers, and also tools that operate at a greater level of distance at the supply chain decision maker level. Another important piece of the backdrop for us to address at the table here is the critique that tech in and of itself is not enough, and we would absolutely embrace that tech in and of itself is not likely to lead the sort of change that is needed at the scale that it is needed. It's a meaningful piece of the intervention, but it's not going to be sufficient to change the way in which the vast majority of workers work worldwide. So we want to address today, especially, where does tech lead to the kinds of changes that we all want to see? Another important piece of the backdrop is the deeper critique of the use of tech, which should also be represented here, articulated particularly most recently by Laurie Berg and Bettina Faubenblom from Australia in an article paper that they did, came out in April, articulating concerns that tech will potentially provide risk to workers who speak up, and certainly the privacy risks that workers face as they articulate a grievance or participate in a survey, or otherwise use tech to support themselves is an important consideration. And I know Heidi from Kenzen will particularly have stuff to say about that. There's also a concern that the data that is gathered through technological means from workers is insufficient to lead to meaningful changes. And then lastly, there's a concern that it can enable the users of tech, particularly the multinational users and the employer, the supplier users, to embrace a kind of reputational or superficial or a compliance response as opposed to a deeper and structural change. All of those are, of course, reasonable concerns and critiques. And again, our job is not to deny those critiques, and it's not to embrace a sort of a particularly rosy picture of tech. It's rather to find the ways with examples from the organizations that you're seeing today that articulate where and how impact can emerge. Like I said, questions along the way. If you have them, I don't see any yet. That's great. We've only just gotten started. We're going to jump in with a kind of a lightning round. This is more or less 3 parts of questions, three topics from me in conversation with these folks, and leavened and improved by the comments that you make. The lightning round is give us, the first sort of answer to the question, what do you do and why do you do it? The first person I'll call on, I think this is what we agreed, is Erika. Erika Wennerstrom is the CEO of Quizrr. She's had an eventful 18 months as the CEO, building on the great organization that was founded by 2 alums from H&M who had experience in supply chains with labor rights. Erika herself comes from a background in business strategy and product and manufacturing in the fashion, apparel, accessory, and IT space. So Erika, what does Quizrr do and why do you do it?
Thank you, Dan. Happy to take the floor here. Some of you might already have or be quite familiar with us, but essentially we are an edtech pioneer in social sustainability. We use a bottom-up approach to help companies unleash human capital in their supply chains. Our path to impact is to create a relevant, engaging content in the form of short live action movies, stories, sort of like following your favorite TV show, actually, to spread knowledge and understanding of key topics like rights and responsibilities, workplace policies, ethical recruitment practices, and more upskilling related content like migrant parenting, wage management, and so on. So these training programs, disguised in this Netflix light costume, I'd say, it uses a lot of interactive components like gamified boards. It has quizzes, obviously, to validate the understanding of the topic that you just watched. And all of this data points is then harnessed and presented back to brands and factories alike, on an aggregated level and on a factory level, to understand the gain points and the pain points of your supply chain from a social aspect.
Awesome.
So all in all, this makes social aspects of upstream's responsibility, it makes it manageable, scalable, and measurable. Sort of like environmental aspects has gone through during the past decades. To date, we have approximately just over 500 factories on our digital platform and humbling 700,000 sessions played by people ranging from migrant workers at arrival borders to production lines across Asia.
Perfect. Well, that's great, Erika. Thank you. Now for the continuing the lightning round to Vera. Vera Belazelkoska will speak about her work with Ulula. She was sort of right there at the co-founding in 2014. You're really at the advent of the space in many ways. A political economy background and someone who's done a lot of work in Latin and South America, as well as in Asia, responsible within Ulula for the relationships with the Responsible Business Association and the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. Vera, same question to you. What is Ulula? What are you doing and why?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. So Ulula is a social innovation startup. Like many of our co-presenters, we use technology and analytics for worker engagement to help organizations monitor and mitigate human rights impacts in their global supply chains. We build accessible anonymized tools and leverage different types of modules like surveys, an anonymized grievance mechanism with a comprehensive case management system, awareness raising modules and platforms, all with the goal of helping organizations with better data. And the goal is that data can help them in their decisions related to more responsible sourcing, ensuring social compliance, but also leading more collaborative improvement initiatives with their partners in their supply chains. So we believe that transparency and accountability can help to collectively achieve better and more dignified work for all. We've worked in many sectors since 2013, including agriculture, manufacturing, mining, and we've worked with a variety of clients, such as Anglo American and De Beers from the extractive sector, Mars and Cargill, as well as civil society groups like Polaris and Oxfam, as well as industry associations like the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil as a multi-stakeholder body and a certification standard, but also the Responsible Business Alliance and the Initiative for Compliance and Sustainability, ICS.
That's great, thank you. And last introduction is to Heidi, the Chief Commercial Officer and co-founder of Kenzen, has spent about 5 years in the industrial wearable market. An experienced entrepreneur, has done mobile platforms and media, including some very successful exits. And I note from her LinkedIn bio that she has a BA originally in art history, demonstrating that people in tech don't all need computer science backgrounds. She is modeling good COVID behavior by wearing a mask because she's in a hotel. So Heidi, tell us, same question, what's Kenzen up to?
Yeah, so hello everybody, and thanks for bearing with me as I battle a somewhat shoddy internet connection and then having to pull my mask up and down periodically. So Kenzen is building the premier physiological monitoring platform to keep workforces safe from heat, fatigue, overexertion, and other illnesses on the job. So the front end of this I'm wearing right here is a device. So this is the data collection piece of what is an entire platform that's been ruggedized for industrial use. So we are sampling the physiology every 5 seconds and collecting about 1.3 million data points per day per worker. And the condition that we're focused on to begin, and where we've been doing some use cases throughout the past couple of years, is on exertional heat, so heat injury on the job. And heat injury is something that is 100% preventable if it's detected ahead of time, but it's very difficult to know if a worker is suffering from heat injury, and it quickly impacts the cognition, dexterity, and hydration of a worker in a high-risk environment that's probably operating heavy machinery, so putting themselves and others at risk. So causes of heat stress, as you can imagine, are very commonly found on work sites. So high exertion, I'm working very, very hard in a high exertion scenario. Poor acclimatization, perhaps I was in air conditioning all weekend, now I'm back on the site. Poor hydration, I haven't had enough to drink. And just high temperature, so it's hot outside. So any one of those can cause heat injury. Put two together and it gets serious pretty quickly. And there are hundreds of millions of these workers that are at risk across the globe. So to date, our customers are large conglomerates across mining, renewable energy, oil and gas, and construction. So I heard someone mention Anglo-American. So we've worked with Anglo-American, BP, GE, Kojima, about to start something with Shimizu over in Japan. So we're excited about that. And we've deployed across the globe, all across the US, Saudi Arabia, UK, Japan, and South Africa. So we're getting some great data points, not just physiologically, but also based on various environments.
That's awesome. Thank you, Heidi. We're going to stick with you, and we're going to.
I'll keep my mask down. It's an efficiency, right? So not up and down.
The core of this is, okay, so you're doing this stuff, and we all either implicitly or explicitly have a theory of change, right? We're doing it because it'll lead somewhere. And we want to make as much as possible this a conversation about sort of where it leads and how close can we get to impact, certainly to outcomes and certainly to outputs. So what examples, what illustrations, what stories can you tell us about how and where Kenzen has led to impact?
Yeah, so I think, fundamentally, we consider ourselves a safety technology. So we're protecting those, those lone workers that are by themselves in a hot environment and nobody's around to monitor them, or an individual on a construction site where it's extremely hot out, or even those that are working around smelters. We were at Alcoa last year, and it can be up to 175 degrees Fahrenheit. So heat injury happens very quickly. So our number one priority is keeping workforces safe. But our feeling is, and as we've done POCs, we find that proof of concepts, for those that are unfamiliar, that as we're keeping workforces safe, we're also adding to productivity. So if a worker is more fit for duty and there's less hospitalization and their health is optimized, they're going to be more productive on the job. And then longer time, so we don't have, or longer term, we don't have data to support this yet, but there would hopefully be, less hospitalization fees, less worker compensation, so you're ultimately saving the company money as well. So we've had 3 POC examples that I'll talk a little bit about today. So the first ever pilot that we did was with GE, and it was up in Maine, and we were very, very excited to talk about and showcase our exertional heat technology, which is focused around predicting core body temperature along with microclimate. And we were assigned to go up into the mountains of Maine in April when there was still snow on the ground. And so we're a young company, and we kind of have to prove ourselves with each POC. And I think we were like, oh no, how are we going to come away with any good data points here? But what we found is, first of all, the wind technicians, just by putting on the personal protective equipment that they need to do their job, their core body temperatures going up immediately. And this just isn't with wind techs, this is with any industrial worker. But also by virtue of their job, they need to climb up 300 feet to the top of a turbine with their PPE, with equipment on, and then they're sometimes up tower, as they call it, for up to 12 hours at a time. And so the exertion that it took to go up those 300 feet to get to the top of the tower was ultimately causing heat injury almost right away. So we were getting those data points almost immediately. So when we reviewed the data, afterwards, and we were with the safety manager, innovation, all of the stakeholders in the POC, what we found was that a lift assist, which are quite common over in Europe, but in the US, we haven't deployed them quite as broadly, would actually make a lot of the wind technicians much more safe. And as it turned out, because this capital investment was made, it would also lend to the productivity of the workers. So small capital investment, and they were, reducing the amount of injuries from overexertion and heat that would have been prevalent even in April, even with snow on the ground in Maine. But also once the workers got to the top, they were much more productive. So they could do their job better and they were less fatigued. And we collect a lot of perceptual data during our POCs from the worker. So we're not just looking physiologically at the readings, which are obviously, probably the most important thing, but also the perception of when I'm resting in a way that's more optimized with my specific physiology, am I feeling better? Do I feel more protected? Do I feel more productive? And so overwhelmingly, the answer was yes. And so this was somewhat of a surprise for us, probably not to our physiologists, but to me and some of the others deploying, was just heat injury can occur at any time. And so there are some unsafe scenarios for workers, even with snow on the grounds. And when it's cold outside, But then also, if you're taking away that, you might be resting more often, but ultimately you're going to build a more productive workforce. Another similar example we had, not similar, is over in the UK. It was again with wind technicians, but these were working around boiler rooms. And so they were actually complaining that they were feeling hot and overheated even before they began the day. So even before they got, too close to the boiler rooms. And I think, through discussions with the safety managers, I think there was almost a little bit of, I don't want to say skepticism, but were these workers really not feeling great, or was this just kind of something that they were saying in the course of a long day of work and, perhaps wanting to shorten the day or something? So what we determined was we would run a proof of concept to understand physiologically what the workers look like before they began the day. And the way our patch works, or our device works, is a worker will wear it for at least a few hours, ideally a day or two, prior to them going on the site. So then we'll understand what their baseline of health is. So we had that understanding. And what we found was that a lot of these boiler room technicians, the minute they got on site, they were almost immediately overheating. And so this was a great thing for us because we really felt like here the workers were saying something. And I don't want to say that, the safety managers or those in more of a corporate setting didn't believe them, but this was good physiological proof that possibly a different form of PPE, one that wicks away the sweat a little bit more, would be advantageous for the workers. And so a new form of PPE was found, invested in, and the workforce then was, much more productive and feeling like they'd removed the immediate risk of heat injury, at least when they showed up on the job. So it may have continued throughout the day.
Hey, Heidi,
So,
yes. A couple of questions are coming in that,
Sure.
that are, yeah, I mean, again, I know you have more examples. And
No, that's okay, please.
And we planned to touch this, but I'll jump in now. Right, in particular about how does the tech protect worker health information, what privacy rights to workers, what privacy rights do workers have to their physiological data, and how do we make sure these aren't used to discriminate against workers? It's also, there's another question which more broadly we can try and answer, which is how transparent are the platforms themselves, both really important perspectives to take and for us to make sure that we're able to respond to. So let's take the privacy piece in particular, because I know you've done a tremendous amount of work on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, we really designed this product with the worker in mind, knowing that we have biometric data that can clearly protect and optimize a worker. So protect them against various injuries and optimize their total worker health, which is a big thing on work sites right now. At the same time, this is data that's more valuable and more critical than perhaps any other piece of data that's being gathered at a work site, certainly from other sensors, but just about anywhere. So, foundationally and at the very beginning of Kenzen, we designed this with 4 distinct different views, and each had different rights and types of data they had access to. So the worker, who generally looks at their data on an app within a phone, is the only one that sees their data in real time and retrospectively. No other view gets that except one other, and only in a certain instance, which I can touch upon in a moment. A safety manager, so they're going to need to monitor a team of people, whether that team is 6 or 10 or 50. What they will see is if a worker needs an intervention. So we're sending alerts to workers. Sometimes the workers won't stop working. So if a safety manager sees that a worker is calibrating or trending in a dangerous direction, they just see enough to intervene, but they don't see anything historically, and they don't see any details about the background of the worker like previously. Corporate EHS, so what we offer them is trend data. So they're going to see all of the data in aggregate and de-identified. And for them, it's all about making the site safer. So maybe that's adjusting shift times, more water stations, making capital investments like a lift assist. So they're not seeing anything individual, but they are seeing everything either on one site or across all sites to make it more safe. So the one instance when somebody would have access to the information of a worker is if it's a severe incident on a site, a severe health incident. Most of these big companies like a GE or BP, they will have, an occupational nurse or medical personnel on the site. So they would get access to see everything in the moment to help. but then that's like attorney-client privilege, so there wouldn't be, you know, wouldn't go any further than that personnel who's assisting the worker. So this is how we designed the product. And again, everybody, so please.
Yeah, great. Just in the interest of time, we're gonna jump off there. I know there's more that
Yes.
more that you could say about that, and indeed there's an online, there will be on the Kenzen website a best-in-class worker privacy policy.
Yes.
As well. Let's turn to Vera. I think you're next, and again, much as Heidi did, can you give us some illustrations as to kind of how does Ulula lead to impacts? How are you conceptualizing the way in which you leverage these partnerships that you have, including worker access to the data itself, such that change happens?
Yes, definitely. So, I mean, the purpose of the business and how we work, and I think also our collective desire, is to amplify worker insights and channel them to the relevant stakeholders and actors that have the leverage to propel evidence-based change. So it's really at our core, when we think about impact measurement, that's what we do for our partners and clients, measuring both negative and positive impacts. But of course, to see change, we need strong corporate partners that can propel that change and make sure that it's cascading throughout their supply chain. So it's, you know, we can help with data, and we don't want to collect data for the sake of collecting data. We want to make sure that that data is actionable. And I'll share two examples. We worked in the Taiwanese manufacturing sector on various projects with different types of partners, but across in this specific region, specifically looking at assessing the vulnerabilities of migrant workers, we were able to identify the persistent use of recruitment fees, especially for migrant labor coming from the Philippines and Vietnam. We were able to unearth and identify more details about the amount of fees that workers are paying to get the job, which is, according to the ILO, should not be legal, and it is a big vulnerability to forced labor. We also were able to identify which entities migrant workers pay, because there's quite a lot of entities along the hiring route, both from origin and destination country, that could put the worker in further vulnerability and indebtedness. And then also whether the workers had to borrow money and how much in order to get that job, just to further contextualize the challenges. Some of this data has been used by our partners to negotiate repayment for workers, so we know that it has achieved some of the intended outcomes. There's, of course, a specific value of our system for this kind of a use case, because it is multilingual and it adapts to the worker's language. So while an investigator on site might not be able to speak Tagalog and Vietnamese and Taiwanese Mandarin, this is where technology can support. Again, we don't pretend like it can do everything. Of course, on the ground engagement and strong relationships are really important. But this is where technology can be that really important driving force in identifying some of this risk, especially from workforces that come from different parts of the world. And then apart from the workplace-wide assessments, we've also been monitoring some impact where a tool has been used to capture more granularity. So looking at our anonymized grievance mechanisms and working in agriculture since 2016, we've been able to identify that our grievance channels have helped workers raise their specific concerns. So not looking at aggregate data and providing those high-risk issues across the supply chain, but rather to hone in on that specific problem that a worker is having that could be a red flag of something more systemic. And that exactly is, for example, one of the projects identified as that wage theft was happening, and not just for one worker, but further investigations showcased that it was a bit more pervasive, and the employer was able to take effective remedy to rectify the problem. So of course, we're not always privy to all of the actions taken by our partners and their suppliers, but we often try to make sure that, you know, we're not embarking on projects that collect data and we really don't understand what are the mechanisms in place to act on that data, but rather to find the right partners that are committed in doing that long-term work in collaboration to make sure that it leads to the intended impacts.
That's great, Vera. Thanks. And right, the granularity in particular, I think, is one thing that's available through tech at scale, rather than all the great work that's being done, you know, sort of on an in-person basis, and certainly the organizations I've been involved in the past that do incredible and deep work on site. the tech enables a sort of a granularity of perspective. But a question has come up that is expressing a concern about how transparent the platforms themselves are. In your case, Ulula, I mean, who has access to the data? Is it being privatized so that corporate clients benefit? Is there a way in which civil society organizations also have access in order to monitor effectiveness?
Yes, definitely. So we have a lot of projects in collaboration with NGOs and civil society groups where the data, we're able to make it public. So, you know, naming and shaming is not really an effective method for us, although of course there is a role for that. And naming and shaming has propelled change, and there are organizations, many of them, who do that effectively to try to push for action and rapid action. But what we do is we try to ensure that the entities that we're collaborating with use that information to try to make a change before it hits the headlines. So in a way it is preventative, but we do definitely have projects whereby we have third-party entities like CSOs part of the project, even if it is a project with corporate partners. For example, we're working with a consortium of entities like processors and traders and consumer goods manufacturers, as well as an NGO that is supporting them as well as the local producers in the process of remedy. And everybody has access to that information. We oftentimes showcase only aggregated information to brands. We never identify specific workers' answers and questions, so we try to ensure that their anonymity and confidentiality are protected. But when it comes to grievance management mechanisms, of course, to arrive to a remedy, we oftentimes do need that two-way engagement with the particular worker. But our platform has designed different safeguards to make sure that the worker identifies him or herself when he or she is ready to do so, and their identity is not disclosed otherwise. But we definitely have built-in multiple access levels, very similar to Kenzen's technology, where we have user groups. So we try to get the data to as many different stakeholders that could use it as possible. However, when we do work with corporate partners, we often know that they come along with various CSO or nonprofit third-party consulting entities to help them on the ground. So oftentimes we do build these multi-stakeholder coalitions when we're working, and those tend to be the most impactful projects as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Vera. And certainly from my experience, it is absolutely and always possible for a buyer, be it a corporate or a supplier or an NGO or a civil society organization or a coalition to adopt a tool that doesn't lead anywhere, right? That's sort of true in general, and it's certainly true with reference to these sorts of tools. It's about the accountability context. And so again, as I said at the outset, we're not suggesting that these tools in and of themselves are going to solve problems, but we're identifying the way in which they can be specifically applied, which is great. Thank you. And Erika, you've been very patient, so thank you. Really eager to hear Quizrr's approach and illustration of impact and how you sort of see Quizrr's role in the space that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. First of all, I can only testament to what you were mentioning just now, Vera, on the multi-stakeholder approach. We often find ourselves in similar situations that where the outputs it's leveraged greatly in various levels, depending on what kind of data you're looking at. And first of all, I think I want to say that the best stories to share in this context, at least, are the ones where we can find these triple effects, where we see effects or positive, where we can trace outcome on brand level or organizational level, on factory management level, and on worker level. And because that's really where the origo, where business and social sustainability can meet and have the best chances for long-term behavioral change, which is eventually what we're working to impact. And so one great example I wanted to bring up is Electrolux. We have the opportunity to work with Electrolux in various markets. And you can read from their sustainability report last year, where they were trying to find out the long-term effects of the training implemented at their key suppliers. One of those that was in the survey, they implemented a training program covering basic rights and responsibilities and workplace dialogue over 12 months. One of these suppliers, approximately 4,000 workers taking the training from management level, mid-management level and worker level, they reported a 7% productivity increase and a 2% decrease in employee turnover. That's really the value that we can provide on a factory management level. On a worker level, I should also mention that we got records then on better dialogue, less like more interactions in between management and workers, better working conditions, less contradictions and less disputes, thanks to a joint understanding of like how to deal with complaints, etc. These are all significant numbers, but we have many similar like independent studies showing more or less the same output or outcomes for both smaller and larger factories. Another relevant example is if we take our digital training platform and place it into the existing ecosystem of audits and compliance mechanisms. We have another client in China who wanted to survey the effectiveness of Quizrr's training in between audits. So out of the 15 suppliers, key suppliers surveyed, they found a 27% increase taking those suppliers from insufficient scoring to acceptable scoring. And that's a fantastic journey, obviously, but it also has, it's people behind all of these scores. And so I think the most heartfelt case that I immediately came to think about when you asked us, Dan, to like think up a few relevant stories, like back in the heydays or early days of Quizrr, kind of, trying to validate the learning methodology and visual components and quizzes and so on. There was a group of business students who went to China to assess the understanding of topics that Quizrr was designing content for. And they found, out of the surveys pulled with workers, almost 1/3 of the workers thought that when the fire alarm goes off, they are supposed to stay at their station until a manager tells them to leave. That's kind of scary. And I think it's a perfect example of how knowledge at the worker level is much more efficient than the ticking the box mentality that has been kind of the overriding principles for a long time now. And now that we have the digital tools to actually push out this knowledge and validate that it's actually infused, not only on a worker level, but mid-management level and management level, that's where the kind of the right soil for worker well-being is being put to work.
That's great.
That's all. I actually, we have a lot of really good stuff, but I think in favor of time, I think we should, there will be some follow-up materials, I think, Dan. So
yeah, absolutely. We're going to send
like super relevant effects or like changes on the factory floors that will be in there for you guys.
You've had, and I do highly recommend, just because I find them entertaining, on the Quizrr website, there's little snippets of some of these stories from Bangladesh and from China, the videos that they show. They're just, I think they're really fun.
Yeah. They will be in the follow-up package as well.
Great. So let's talk COVID. Because sadly we have to. There's another question from Jesse, which we'll get to, Jesse. Other people who have questions, please toss them on in the chat or in the Q&A. COVID is obviously here we are, right? We're not together. We're sitting in each other's screens, which has disrupted the traditional mechanism, or the mechanism that we mostly use to gather information about what's going on in workplaces. And I know each institution here has adjusted to the sort of COVID reality of workplace restrictions and travel restrictions. So I want to make sure we talk, and let's do it for sort of a couple, 3 minutes each, starting with you, Erika. How has Quizrr been pivoting or finding unique value during this sort of more COVID restricted, pandemic restricted times?
Sure. At first, our reptile brain kind of went into work, and we just released all our occupational health and training modules open sourced. This was back in February, to reach factory workers beyond factory walls, basically, or being in quarantine, etc. They were taken by thousands of workers, and we quickly managed to get a lot of like sharing programs going with Better Work, etc. In the impacted geographic regions. Then on the more like long-term axis and more perhaps business-oriented as well, COVID has pushed us into rethinking our methodology, I'd say, and our ability to reach people beyond factory walls, wherever they may be. So this need, it ties in well to what the market needs and what deep impact organizations and so on seem to be in need of right now, to reach beyond factory walls and to raise awareness on critical topics. So time to market, I think what has pushed us really in this era is time to market, deployment channels, flexibility, and our agility at being like a small entity that has really strengthened our position during this situation. So it's all about like digital and replicable models, not reinventing what others have already done. A perfect example, I think, is our long-term relationships are really playing out at their fullest during these circumstances, with an excellent example of partnering up with UN, their Promise program, United Nations migrant organ, where we originally trained migrant workers at arrival centers at the borders. Arrival centers are closed now, so we train them using different deployment channels, basically, to reach them where they are, and they're extraordinarily vulnerable at this point, not having support mechanisms in place, or being in between borders, in between work, etc., etc. So those are excellent examples, I think, that
and I appreciate, right,
forward.
Not only immediately responding, but also trying to take into account kind of what are some ongoing concerns, not only related to the pandemic, but also what are some opportunities. And Vera, I'd love to get your thoughts about this next, sort of not only how have you responded to the restrictions of COVID, but where do you see this all going, right? Like, to what extent is this enabling a kind of a rethinking or a reapplication that's applicable for whatever the new reality will be, at least in the sort of medium term? Yeah.
I think we have the benefit of already working with a tool that is, cost effective, remote, and able to be deployed at scale. But of course, with the pandemic has really propelled us to leverage our agility and respond quickly and adapt our technology, our methodologies, as well as our survey instruments to support some of our current partners and new partners in capturing risks related to COVID. Of course, the pandemic has further exacerbated some of the already systemic issues related to pay and hours and wages and so on. But on top of it has added new health and safety concerns. It's the auditing environment has obviously also changed with travel restrictions and new safety protocols in factories that don't allow third parties to enter. But also we've seen a bit of a necessity for brands and buyers to do more with less. And already we were well positioned for that to step up and support. But I think our team really worked hard in the first weeks of some of the initial lockdowns. So while some of the auditing firms are still trying to figure out how to adapt the worker interview component to ensure that the veracity of remote assessments, we had already weeks in had launched surveys in 8 countries and collected data from 20,000 workers on very specific indicators that are showing new types of vulnerabilities, like very heightened fear and anxiety of job termination, unpaid sick leave and quarantine leave, and also issues related to gaps in health coverage. So I think the pandemic has definitely helped us think on our toes. We also do understand that the current situation is is not only amplifying existing issues, but bringing forth new ones that, for example, the dynamic between purchasing practices and impact on workers' lives. So recently we've started a collaboration with the Better Buying Initiative, and this will be a published research where we're going to try to understand the correlation between purchasing practices and impact on workers' lives in India. So stay tuned for that. But it definitely, I think this current situation has shown that we have to be creative, to think. Obviously, a lot of workplaces have shifted to digital engagement, and we cannot drop the ball for workers in the supply chain. This is what we have to work with right now. All of us have adapted, so we need to make sure that some other processes continue to adapt for the most vulnerable people in global supply chains.
Wonderful, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let me stick with you for a second in answer to Jesse's question that relates to sort of both where we are now and where we're going. And the question is, are workers able to gain access to their own data? Heidi, we'll get to you. I know you've already told us they do uniquely, but for Vera, is there feedback loops that provide workers a sense that their feedback or concerns are being addressed?
Yes, definitely. So we work with our clients to incentivize that they inform workers about what they're learning and what are the actions that they're going to take. Obviously, we cannot always impact what gets communicated back, but we definitely try and achieve that objective with some of our strong partners. But also in terms of closing the feedback loop on very specific issues and grievances, our grievance management mechanism does allow case managers to follow up with workers, request more information, as well as communicate remedy without disclosing and knowing their identity. So we've established these two-way mechanisms for communication that continue to protect the worker, and the worker does receive a response, because of course, none of us would participate in surveys or submit grievances expecting change if we never hear back from the people that supposedly these insights are landing on. So it's really important to close the feedback loop. And yes, we do implement that as a really strong component into most of our programs.
Awesome, thank you. All right, Heidi, to you for COVID response. And then we have 5 questions lined up, which we're gonna nail in the last 10 minutes after you get done telling us about COVID.
Okay, great.
A fast
Okay.
response. So yeah,
Perfect.
so over to you.
I'll quickly breeze through COVID here. I mean, for us, interestingly, it really expanded our demand in the market. I mean, similar to Vera and Erika, we had some tactical short-term things that we had to work out with our current deployments and doing them remotely. So because we're actually working with physical devices and phones that need to be on site, and we had deployments this summer in places like Japan and South Africa, where we were quite concerned, like if we can't be there to help set these workers up, not that it's complicated, but you're dealing with different languages and things like that, are they going to be successful? So that was something initially that we had to come up with some innovation in terms of how do we pull this off. And I'll happily say we were able to be successful there. So, 2 things we did is we created a language translation app. So in Japan and even in South Africa, things were easily understood. And we also just found a way, remotely to really connect, have an agent on the ground. And so all of our POCs, I think, actually even went better than we could have imagined, simply because we were able to have those strong connections with people on the ground we might not have otherwise. So thankfully that worked out. From a more strategic level though, because we do physiological monitoring, we started getting a lot of inbound requests. And obviously we're focused on heat fatigue and overexertion, but people associate us with, looking at the physiology in real time. And so we started being asked, could we also detect illness? So, picture large industrials that all now have one goal, or that, they're aligned around one goal, which is called pandemic proofing. So COVID-19, hopefully we find a vaccine for that soon, within the next year or so. But the notion is that there's going to be other pandemics, and it's going to impact us more profoundly than it has in the past. So how do we understand when somebody is at risk for contagion? So in particular, and we've done mostly outdoor work to date with construction and field crews and things like that, but we were approached by, think of large warehousing companies, they work with big e-commerce companies now with large warehousing facilities, large manufacturers and large mines where it's more indoors and things spread very, very quickly. could we understand if somebody was about to become contagious? So there's a lot of temperature monitoring and fever checks, but when you have a fever, you've actually already been contagious for up to 24 hours. So it's good to root those people out of industrial settings, but you're not necessarily stopping the contagion. And there's also ways to suppress a fever when you get on a site. So we did an evaluation with our science team, our physiologists, and what it turned out is that we had all the right sensors. We just needed a little bit of algorithm development to determine if an individual was off their core baseline of health. And if we could understand if they were off their core baseline of health, it means that up to 24 to 48 hours in advance of having something that might be contagious, and it could be COVID-19, it could be flu, it could be TB, which is actually still a large problem in some of the mines in South Africa, that we could help keep the workforce healthy in ways that we would have never even thought of on our own because we are so very focused on particular things. So we were fortunate. We went back and we raised some additional capital to be able to focus on this from an R&D perspective. And so thank you very much to Working Capital because they did participate in that round. And we're also on the early stages of a co-development relationship with a large mining conglomerate in South Africa to develop this specifically for that use case scenario. So I think COVID made us look at what we have in terms of physiological monitoring in a different way than we had at the outset, but it's broadened it and makes us feel like we're solving an even bigger problem than we'd set out to. So this is something that hopefully will be available 2021. That's what we're saying, second half. So
stick with one of the questions that came in.
Yeah,
from
sure.
Is relates to cost. So not necessarily the COVID piece, but the core. Give me, if you can, sort of 30 seconds on.
Sure.
On cost now and where you anticipate cost going, because it's been a big part of the conversations that we've had with you as well, as we anticipate it being cheaper as time goes on and therefore more applicable to more workplaces.
I mean, part of that, so, as we present ourselves to the world, we're a data insight company, right? So we're providing relevant data in real time that's going to help, keep a worker healthier and predict things before they occur. But one of our biggest costs right now, I mean, we're still a small company, is hardware. So getting those hardware costs down is absolutely key to being able to approach the market the way we want to. And our pricing model is on a per worker per month basis. But that can only become a lowered cost as we scale. So moving into what we call large batch manufacturing is a very key trigger point in bringing our product costs down. So that's a lot of where we're headed now. So we've just recently embarked on a relationship with a South Korean manufacturer, so our costs can go way down. So that's something that's going to make the cost more accessible to average workforces. But then, Dan, as you've pointed out, reaching one of the highest risk groups just for exertional heat, which is where we started, is agriculture. And they tend to spend probably the least amount on their employees. And in part that's because it's a lot of migrant workers. So it's just a different structure, but our goal is over time, as we scale, as we expand, to have different models. And this might be from things like device sharing, not as popular now with COVID-19. Everybody wanted to do it, and all of a sudden nobody wants to do it. But there's definitely ways to keep the device very sanitized and clean, but through things like device sharing and just being able to scale the company generally, what we hope to do is reach those workforces that perhaps need it the most, because healthcare is just not what it should be. And so detecting illness from contagious disease to heat and fatigue and overexertion becomes even more important.
Awesome, thank you. Vera's been hard at work typing in answers to some of the questions that have come up already. I would assume, Heidi, the answer to the question, do you see potential for these tools to support large-scale infrastructure projects in developing states to support companies in engaging impacted communities? The answer would be yes.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, as we sort of look at, what does it take for us to scale generally? So first thing is just usability of the product. The workers have to accept it. And that was a little bit of a challenge initially, just in the placement. We started on the chest with an adhesive, a lot of body hair issues, as you can imagine, with men in particular. So the arm is a good place for that. Now we've got great user acceptance. But I'd say the second criteria is really just, is this going to scale, right? So it's one thing running a proof of concept or a pilot with 50 people or 50 workers, and then thinking to scaling to thousands of workers. So making sure that we are scalable in all different types of technology situations is is absolutely key to how we're thinking about the product now. And that takes all different types of pathways, depending on, is it indoor, is it outdoor? Are phones allowed on the site? What kind of cellular is there? So there's many, many different dynamics. So our engineering team is up later most nights than they probably wish to be, but that's because we're starting to see large scale demand. So it's exciting.
Erika, I'm going to turn to you for another question. If this can this increased visibility into working conditions and the treatment of workers be used to create impact and performance metrics? Are there any plans for using these metrics for something more than operational improvement or disclosure? It's a complicated question, but I know you've given thoughts to the way in which the measurement that Quizrr enables can be used more generally. So what are your
Great.
thoughts?
I was hoping to get that question. I'm going to paint it out a little bit, perhaps, but yes, I mean the data that we harness is anonymized and then aggregated. So as a brand or an organization, you can have an overview of the toggled on factories, and we have this pretty different from what Heidi just explained. We have this more plug and play scenario where you can be up and running in a couple of days, because it's a lightweight solution, obviously, and not requiring, and that's a really important part of the deployment strategies here. It should be easy to get started. We get training plans digitally set up quite fast, and you can train through your workforce over a period of months, depending on the pace that you set. So back to the question, the data points currently is used to, of course, provide insights, key insights to brands and factories transparently. What are their key gain points, benchmarked? What are the pain points that they can, focus their investments on from a training and knowledge perspective? And looking at that capacity building, obviously, in the different areas of training and the different areas of topics, modern slavery, et cetera, et cetera. The next leg of that is what we're currently exploring and are actually doing, since I think the first couple of proof of concepts has been out earlier this year, is to use the data to connect it to conscious consumer choices. So brands, since this is IRL data, you can easily see which factories are training their workforce and which are not. And some of the brands with a progressive profile and wanting to make these claims, obviously, as part of their responsibility, upstream's responsibility, they place either on their products. This is a product that's produced in a factory that educates their workforce on rights and responsibilities, for instance. We have that in retail and we have it online. So, forward a year or two from now, I see this becoming a quite strong tool, competitive tool, as the rise of the conscious consumer is a really relevant parameter that brings the understanding of like the generations that we are catering to these days. They don't only care about where products are made, they're also caring how products are made. And we can portray that in an online solution, swaying customers' decisions, basically.
Right, perfect. A way of sort of taking not just, I mean, it's an answer to the last question I will get to, right, which is concern that somehow the social audits are already filling too much bandwidth. I think if we only think about sort of the way in which this is or part of a social audit, or the way in which the social audit kind of continues eternally into the future, we're missing a promise that the tools that these three women have described capture. And that promise is to essentially create much more real-time, much more worker-generated, much more broad-based and democratized information and access to information and participation in the decisions that need to take place, including insofar as we can ultimately create distinction among factories that are factories, workplaces, smallhold farms, infrastructure, any place where people work in vulnerable conditions. We can create distinctions among them at a level that's granular enough to enable buyers and or consumers and or regulators to make the right kind of choices among them. And it seems to me that there's an obvious way in which these three technologies represented by these three great women offer a vision of the future that's very different from the way in which the space has operated in the past. that's all we got today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Louise, I'm sorry you didn't get your question in, but you've asked, can Kenzen partner with insurance companies? The answer is yes. We'll get back to you. You'll be hearing more from us as a follow-up, access to the recording, some additional information. Welcome your feedback. Our great colleague Ivy Olson is going to send out a survey with request for feedback as well. Thank you for getting up early, staying up late, and joining us. Much appreciation to Erika, Vera, and Heidi for their great participation. All right.
Goodbye.
Thanks,
Thank you for the opportunity.
all right. Take care, all.
Bye.
Bye now.
Thank you.